For years, Oak Island has stood at the center of one of the world's most enduring treasure mysteries. The whispers of buried riches, ancient artifacts, and secret societies have lured adventurers and historians alike. But among all those who have tried to uncover the island's secrets, none have come closer than the trio of Dan Blankenship, Rick Lagina, and Marty Lagina. These names are etched into the island's modern history, each man bound by a relentless obsession to discover the truth beneath the surface. But what if everything we thought we knew was just the surface of a much deeper story? What if a discovery had already been made, kept hidden from the public eye, concealed even from close collaborators? The Oak Island mystery isn't just about buried treasure. It's about trust, legacy, and unspoken agreements between men who dared to challenge fate. At the center of it all, Dan Blankenship, the stoic and tireless treasure hunter who dedicated over half a century of his life to the cause. He's become a legendary figure known for enduring both physical and financial hardships in his pursuit of the island's secrets. But in the quiet corners of the island's history, rumors have lingered. Rumors that Dan may have found something significant, something so valuable or dangerous that he chose to keep it hidden. Rick Lagina, the passionate dreamer who idolized Oak Island's legends since reading about it in Reader Digest as a child, once considered Dan not just a partner, but a mentor. Their bond appeared unshakable. Rick saw in Dan a kindred spirit, someone who believed in the myth just as deeply. But the longer Rick spent on the island, the more time he had to dig, not just into the earth, but into the past. And what he began to uncover sent shock waves through the core of their shared mission. Hidden logs, hushed conversations, inconsistencies in the excavation records, all pointing toward one haunting possibility. Dan Blankenship may have discovered treasure years before the cameras ever rolled. It didn't start as a confrontation. It started as curiosity. Rick's habit of reviewing old excavation reports from the 1970s and 80s led him down a paper trail that didn't quite add up. Specific dig coordinates had been redacted. Photographs from certain depths were missing. Yet, in personal journals found among Dan's belongings, there were sketches of objects never publicly disclosed, symbols etched into stone, what looked like markings from an ancient language, even notations about metallic anomalies deeper than anyone had previously reached, suggesting some form of constructed chamber or vault. Rick brought these findings quietly to Marty. Unlike his brother, Marty had always approached the island with a healthy dose of skepticism. His background in engineering and business made him pragmatic. He respected Dan, but he never shared the same emotional attachment that Rick did. So, when Rick told him that Dan might have been hiding something, Marty's reaction was colder than expected. Not disbelief, not outrage, just silence, followed by a single question. "Are you sure?" The brothers had always worked as a team, but this new revelation threatened that unity. Rick wanted to go deeper, both literally and metaphorically. He wanted to re-excavate the sites Dan had once claimed were too dangerous or unpromising. Marty wasn't convinced it was the right move. He worried about the optics. Dan was gone. He couldn't defend himself, and dragging his name into controversy might tarnish the very legacy they were trying to honor. But Rick insisted. For him, the truth mattered more than reputations. Tensions began to rise behind the scenes. What the public saw on television was a united front, a team navigating setbacks and celebrating small victories. But off-camera, heated discussions were becoming more frequent. Rick grew increasingly obsessed with connecting the dots. He began poring over old footage, conducting private interviews with workers who had been on the island during Dan's prime. And that's when the story took an explosive turn. One of the workers, a man named Gerald, who had retired years ago, agreed to speak to Rick privately. In that meeting, he dropped a bombshell. He claimed that in the early 1990s, Dan and a small crew had hit something in one of the deeper shafts, something that changed the course of their dig. According to Gerald, they had uncovered a sealed wooden structure containing metallic objects. The crew was sworn to secrecy. Photographs were taken, samples collected, and the shaft was immediately sealed and filled in. No report was ever filed with authorities. No mention of it was made to investors. It was as if the discovery had never happened. Rick was stunned. He pressed Gerald for more information. Why would Dan keep this a secret? What did he find down there that was so valuable or so dangerous it couldn't be revealed? Gerald didn't have all the answers, but he offered a chilling theory. Dan believed that the treasure might be cursed or that revealing it would attract the wrong kind of attention. There were even suggestions that Dan had been warned by certain organizations to stop digging. Whether those warnings came from government bodies, private collectors, or something more clandestine, no one could say for sure. Rick took this information to Marty, expecting support. Instead, Marty exploded. The idea that Dan had hidden something this monumental and that Rick was willing to bring it to light now felt like betrayal. Not betrayal of Dan, but betrayal of their mission's integrity. Marty believed that making this public could derail everything. Investors might pull out. Legal trouble could follow. The island could be seized. It was too risky. But for Rick, the choice had already been made. If Dan had found treasure, real tangible proof of something buried, then the world deserved to know. The years of speculation, the millions spent, the lives invested, it all demanded closure. He began compiling his evidence into a timeline, cross-referencing Gerald's claims with Dan's journals and the gaps in excavation data. Piece by piece, a picture began to emerge, one that pointed to a deliberate cover-up of a discovery that could redefine Oak Island's entire legend. Rick's conviction only grew stronger as he connected more dots. He discovered that shortly after the alleged find in the 1990s, Dan had quietly purchased more land adjacent to the dig sites. He'd also shifted his focus from the deep shafts to much more shallow operations. Something that didn't make sense to Rick unless Dan was deliberately avoiding further attention. Dig log showed unusually vague entries during that period. Where Dan's notes had once been meticulous, suddenly there were days, sometimes weeks of missing information, and yet equipment was still being used, fuel was still being consumed, and expenses were quietly racking up. Rick found one entry that struck him particularly hard. It was scribbled in the margins of an old field notebook, almost as if it was never meant to be found. It read, "The truth is deeper than the shaft. Some secrets must be kept until the world is ready." Rick stared at the sentence for hours. It was Dan's handwriting. It didn't confirm anything explicitly, but it said everything implicitly. If Dan had found something, he clearly believed the timing or the implications weren't right for the world to know. That didn't sit well with Rick, whose core belief had always been that the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, should come to light. The rift between the brothers widened. Marty began pulling back from certain operations, focusing more on logistics and less on direct exploration. Rick, meanwhile, became consumed by his own off-the-books investigation. He started working closely with a select team of historians, Codereekers, and even linguists to analyze the strange markings found in Dan's sketches. One expert suggested the symbols resembled Templar iconography, possibly connected to sacred geometry or ancient maps. Another believed they could be linked to Middle Eastern or Phoenician languages. Either way, the evidence was mounting that Dan may have uncovered something of historical, if not monetary, value. As Rick pressed on, he began to attract attention, not just from curious researchers or fans of the show, but from people who seemed more interested in stopping him than helping. Anonymous emails started arriving. Some were vague warnings. Others were more direct. Leave the past buried. Stop digging. Some things are meant to stay hidden. Rick initially dismissed them as internet trolls or conspiracy theorists. But one message changed that. It contained an old photograph, an aerial view of Oak Island taken from a drone in the early 90s, long before such tech was mainstream. The location in the photo matched the coordinates Gerald had mentioned. The image showed heavy equipment clustered around a site that was never acknowledged publicly. And there in the center was a rectangular excavation pit, something big enough to hold a significant find. Rick shared the photo with Marty, hoping it would finally convince him. But Marty's reaction was the opposite of what he expected. He was furious. He accused Rick of being reckless, of endangering the entire operation, and of betraying the trust they had built with Dan and the rest of the team. To Marty, digging into Dan's secrets wasn't just disrespectful. It was dangerous. He believed that if Dan chose not to reveal something, he had a reason. Marty warned Rick that exposing it now could jeopardize not only their personal safety but the future of the entire treasure hunt. Legal battles, government seizures, media chaos, it could all spiral out of control. But Rick wasn't backing down. He argued that the truth had to come out no matter the cost. The world had followed their journey for years, invested emotionally and financially in the mystery. They deserved to know if there had already been an answer hidden in plain sight. The conflict came to a head during a private meeting with the team. Rick laid out all the evidence. Dan's journals, Gerald's testimony, the anonymous photograph, the coded symbols, the gaps in the dig logs. It was compelling, emotional, even haunting. Some team members sided with Rick, urging a deeper investigation. Others echoed Marty's caution, warning that stirring up the past could undo everything they'd built. But the tipping point came when Rick produced a sealed envelope he had found among Dan's stored belongings. It was marked with Dan's initials and the words, "For when the time is right." With shaking hands, Rick opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No map, no detailed confession, just a quote. "To find the greatest treasure, one must first lose certainty. Only then can truth be unearthed." The message was cryptic, but Rick saw it as validation. Dan had known. He had found something. He had deliberately left a trail. Not for the world, not for treasure hunters, but for someone like Rick, someone who wouldn't stop, someone who believed. Marty, still unconvinced, stormed out of the meeting. It was the most intense confrontation the brothers had ever had. For the first time, it seemed like the mystery of Oak Island was tearing them apart rather than bringing them together. Despite Marty's disapproval, Rick moved forward. He commissioned a fresh excavation of the area marked in the 1990s photo. Permits were secured discreetly. The crew was kept small. Every move was documented. And when the dig finally reached the suspected depth, what they found was both shocking and mystifying. Hidden beneath the layers of earth and time was a sealed wooden vault. It matched the dimensions described by Gerald and hinted at construction techniques inconsistent with modern tools. The wood dated back several hundred years. Carbon dating confirmed it, but the structure was clearly tampered with more recently, possibly during Dan's secret dig. Inside the vault were fragments, not gold, not jewels, but something arguably more valuable. Pieces of parchment sealed in wax tubes, metal shards inscribed with unfamiliar symbols, and a small stone tablet carved with a map, one that did not match any known layout of the island. The discovery was quietly documented, stored, and sent for analysis. Rick chose not to publicize it. Not yet. Despite everything, he still held some reverence for Dan's decision to keep it hidden. But now he had a responsibility to make sense of it all before the world found out. Marty, still angry but visibly shaken, visited the site under cover of night. For a long time he said nothing, just stood there looking down at the open vault. Then he turned to Rick and asked, "What are you going to do now?" Rick replied, "Finish what Dan started, but this time with the truth." The discovery shifted everything. The story of Oak Island was no longer about searching for treasure. It was about understanding why it was hidden in the first place. What did Dan know that made him protect it? What power did the artifacts hold? And why were people still trying to keep them buried? As Rick dove deeper into the mystery, he realized this wasn't the end of the search. It was the beginning of a much larger journey, one that would test his beliefs, challenge alliances, and force the world to rethink what it thought it knew about history, secrecy, and the very nature of truth. Rick knew that what they had uncovered was more than just an archaeological find. It was a key to a story far older and far more complex than anyone had imagined. The objects in the vault weren't mere relics. They were pieces of a narrative hidden beneath centuries of soil and secrecy. The wax-sealed parchments, once carefully opened in a controlled environment, revealed sketches of emblems long associated with secret societies. Symbols eerily similar to those found in Freemason and Templar archives. Even more intriguing were the coded passages written in a mix of Latin, Old French, and an unrecognizable cipher. It would take months to even begin decoding them. Rick brought in specialists in ancient scripts and cryptography. Slowly, patterns began to emerge. The text spoke of guardians of the knowledge, of burdens too heavy for kings and wisdom that must sleep beneath the oak. There were references to Jerusalem, to voyages across the Atlantic, and to a sacred relic split into fragments and buried in multiple locations, Oak Island being one of them. This wasn't just about gold or lost manuscripts. It hinted at a spiritual or philosophical treasure, something with the power to change beliefs or challenge institutions. Marty, although still conflicted, was no longer dismissive. The evidence was undeniable. Even his analytical mind couldn't ignore the mounting weight of proof. But his concern only deepened. If Dan Blankenship had kept this quiet for decades, he must have known the consequences of exposing it. Rick and Marty now stood on the edge of a truth that might not just make history, it might rewrite it. As word of the vault's content spread quietly through academic and archaeological circles, new figures began to reach out. Some were supportive, historians eager to help piece together the puzzle. Others were more shadowy, sending vague messages about the responsibility that comes with knowledge. One anonymous letter warned them directly. The island is a safeguard, not a prize. Disturb it further and consequences will follow. Rick refused to be intimidated. But he also realized that this wasn't just about discovery anymore. It was about stewardship, about guarding a truth that had been hidden for a reason. He made the controversial decision to halt the public side of their exploration, withdrawing from major filming activities and keeping the next stages of research confidential. The team agreed, forming a tight circle of trust around the new findings. Meanwhile, the coded map on the stone tablet became the focal point. Unlike anything seen before, it depicted not only Oak Island, but distant points, locations across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. The inscriptions suggested these were linked through a network of knowledge bearers, individuals, or groups tasked with hiding and protecting information through the ages. One symbol placed at the center of Oak Island matched the layout of the original money pit, but in the margins were unfamiliar notations, including one that translated loosely to "the decoy is the door." Rick and Marty now had to confront an even bigger question. What if the money pit itself had always been a misdirection? What if all the years of digging had been focused on a carefully crafted diversion while the real vaults, the ones Dan may have found, were hidden in plain sight elsewhere? It reframed the entire legend, turning the idea of booby traps and flooding tunnels from security measures into narrative tools meant to keep searchers away from the real goal. The team quietly began new digs in previously overlooked areas, guided by the decoded clues. In one such dig near the island's northeast shore, they uncovered a subterranean tunnel system older than anything found before. Inside were remnants of human activity, carved staircases, primitive light sources, and more symbols. Whatever was here had been built with purpose. And then, at the deepest point, they found it. A circular stone chamber with a domed ceiling carved with constellations. In the center sat a pedestal. On it was a small sealed box. Inside that box was what appeared to be a manuscript fragment, aged, delicate, and written in a script that none of the team could identify immediately. But one symbol on the parchment matched a symbol from the Templar archives. Thiki Rho, an ancient Christian emblem. This was a direct connection between Oak Island and the theories of sacred religious artifacts, possibly even the legendary Holy Grail, not as a cup, but as knowledge. Marty, upon seeing it, went silent. After a long pause, he said, This is what he was protecting." Rick nodded, his eyes fixed on the delicate document. Dan knew this would change everything. He wanted to keep it safe until someone was ready. And now it's our turn to decide what happens next. With heavy hearts and reverence, the brothers agreed to protect the chamber and its contents. They arranged for the preservation of the site and brought in archivists to ensure nothing would be damaged. They documented everything, but they didn't release it to the public, at least not yet. The world wasn't ready. The findings needed to be studied, contextualized, and understood before they could be shared. In the months that followed, Rick quietly worked with trusted historians and institutions to analyze the texts. The preliminary translations revealed themes of universal truth, warnings about greed, and messages about humanity's tendency to destroy what it doesn't understand. Whether this was part of a global conspiracy, a religious order's final message, or simply a philosophical legacy, one thing was clear. Oak Island was never about riches. It was about wisdom. Dan Blankenship hadn't just been a treasure hunter. He was a guardian of something far more precious. And now Rick and Marty were those guardians. Their roles had changed. The show, the hunt, the cameras, they had all been part of a much larger journey toward understanding. And so, with the eyes of the world still glued to Oak Island, unaware of the quiet revelation unfolding beneath their feet, the Lagina brothers stood side by side, divided at times by fear, frustration, and fury, but now reunited by truth. In the end, Marty wasn't furious because Rick exposed Dan's secret. He was furious because he understood what it meant, that their quest was no longer about uncovering what lay buried, but about protecting what had been found. Not every treasure is meant to shine in the spotlight. Some treasures are meant to illuminate the soul. And on Oak Island, the greatest discovery may not have been gold or jewels, but a story of trust, legacy, and the silent promise between men who chose to guard a secret not for themselves but for the future.